Hey guys, welcome to this week's podcast episode for the Financial Freedom Podcast. And I'm really excited about today's guest, Clint Rusch. He's a leader, innovator, team builder, problem solving. He's had a military background. And so today's talk is going to be all about leadership, decision-making habits. I love talking to people from the military with that background because they're able to give a systematic dissection of success. So, Clint, welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Systematic dissection, man. I'm nervous right off the bat. I like where we're going though.
I'm a surgeon so that's how I.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Tell people, your background, how you got started, and we'll get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Minnesota. I went to college at the University of Wisconsin. I dropped out of school and joined the Army the day after September 11th. And then over the next 8 years, the Army, in their, let's call it limited wisdom, sent me back to college and finished my degree, and then brought me back on active duty as an officer. And so I spent time enlisted, I spent time as an officer. And then in 2009, when I got out of the Army, I went to work in transportation. So I worked in trucking, and I had never done anything like that before. And so it was a really interesting, career change for me. But a few things led me there, and we can talk about that if you're curious. But the short version is, it was 2009, and they agreed to pay me, every other week, which in 2009 was pretty awesome. And so I ended up really loving supply chain. I found myself really cottoning to this idea of being able to see, an organization and understand every part of that organization. Really, be able to dig into decisions from a very holistic way. It really aligned with my military experience. So spent a few years in trucking, went to work in finance in the pharmaceutical industry, which I realize is a weird transition, but I started in supply chain and then moved into finance. So it's a little less weird. And then moved into consulting. I spent some time working in management consulting, then moved into healthcare and led a healthcare organization, and then was recruited away from there to come here to Kansas City, where I live now, and I led a global logistics firm for the last 3 years, which very recently just stepped down from leading that organization and have been, taking the summer for myself and kind of revitalized myself. And I'm enjoying this idea of like sleeping in and taking days off and things that I just didn't know existed for the last 3 years. And then this fall, I'll be joining a new organization and getting to work with them. So really excited about that. But that's me in a nutshell. It's kind of a circuitous path, but that's it.
Yeah, fascinating because this idea, which we'll talk about leadership and decision making, these are skills that are applicable to your military, consulting, healthcare, all these different fields. Yeah. One question I have is these, especially decision making, because I was watching this YouTube about Navy SEAL training, and they talk about like this training where it's like they have to really make sure they're making great decisions under like extreme duress. Talk about these types of decisions.
Yeah. So I think one of the things about decision making, and I'm fascinated by the idea of decision making, right? Like just the concept of how, people's minds work to select courses of action and say, look, we're considering these three options. Which of the three options is the best? Like the game theory that you just walk through without knowing you're doing it, I think it's just fascinating, right? I think it's an amazing thing that makes people, like it makes humans what we are. And I think it to your point, it's something that really transcends industry and geography and sector and size and team, like everything. It is truly a universal concept. So like where I come from, with decision making, I think a lot of it is rooted in two experiences I had when I was in the military. The first was when I was I was a cadet, right? So I had gotten sent back to college, and so all the guys who had been enlisted first, right, when we started in ROTC, which is what I came back for, all the guys who had been enlisted first, like we knew how to march, right, because we had been in basic training. And so the first week, they put us in charge, right? So like the instructors would say, okay, these guys who have, and I'm not joking, like the ability to march was a part of why we were put in that role, because like then you could stand in formation and like you actually know what to do. And when they give commands, you go like, hey, here's what we do, right? And the guys who don't know, they kind of just, monkey see, monkey do. But we're doing this, this is early on. We're doing this tactical exercise. And so I'm in charge of a squad of about 8 guys. And, we're out in the woods and we're practicing this very basic battle drill, right? Which is a squad attack. And I remember in the moment, I gave the, here's the plan, here's what we're going to do. And it's all written down. Like, this is stuff, I'm not innovating here, right? I'm just regurgitating. Something went wrong. Like something didn't happen the way I expected it to happen. Right. And all of a sudden I didn't know what to do. And I just froze up, right? Like I completely froze up, and everyone's looking at me. And for the first time, and look, I had led stuff, I was captain of a swim team in high school, and I had been a leader like my whole life. But like, this was suddenly this gravity and this weight that was hitting me. And I froze. And afterward, I was talking to one of my instructors, and, he said, well, how many choices were you deciding between? And I said, well, I mean, there's an infinite number of choices that you can consider, right? I mean, there are. And he said, okay, don't give me that. Like, that's garbage. It's garbage. I know it's garbage. How many were you choosing between? And I said 3. And he said, okay, so if you threw a dart against the wall, right? Like, if you just put those up against the wall and threw a dart, what's the odds you get it right? And I said 1 out of 3. And he said, and if you don't make a decision at all, what's the odds you get it right? And I said, 0 out of 3. He slams his hat on his desk and he says, then throw the damn dart. Like, just make a decision, right? Like, make a decision. And it was something that, like, that hit me, which is this idea that, like, yes, it's important to make the right decision, but choosing not to make a decision is making the decision. The exercise has an end game. You go through this process of decision making. And I think a lot of people believe that, like, well, maybe we'll just think a little bit more about it tomorrow. And you can't do that. You have to actually make a choice. So that was the first experience. The second experience that really, informed it for me was my time in Iraq. And so I was in Iraq from 2007 to 2009. And one of the things that we did while I was there was we built this large barrier wall across the southern end of Sadr City. And, if you've seen the movie American Sniper, at the end of it, they dramatize it very poorly. I will say very, very poorly. But they dramatized that operation. There's no doctrine on that. No one in the history of warfare had ever built a barrier wall out of concrete barriers in urban combat while you're being engaged from both sides in an air. Like, there's no book you can open. And so there was very much hey, listen, guys, we just got to figure this out as we go. And we got to be really comfortable with the idea that the decisions we make are wrong. We're going to get it wrong. And that's okay. But what's not okay is not to recognize that we're wrong. So it became this incredible recycling process, right? Of, like, we try something and then immediately you're looking for feedback to say, did we get it right? Do we need to tweak it 10%? Do we need to tweak it 5%? And I think that, coupled with this experience that I had that said you have to make a decision, those two things, and then you add to that the third factor of there's some pretty weighty consequence to this decision, right? Like, people are living and dying based on our choices. And those three, that kind of triangle of decision making, it became an incredible heuristic to drive to, like, really good decisions really quickly. But it also kind of drove this idea of, how do I internalize this idea that I have to get it right? Right? Like, it's weighty and it's challenging, and let's just figure it out. Like, it's okay to be wrong, but it's not okay to be really wrong. And that's a really weird dichotomy. And I loved it.
Really fascinating, because, one thing I wanted to get into is this element of decisions, because, the rapidity of how fast you make the decision, and also the consequence of the decision. Like, some decisions have huge consequences. So do you make those, like, snap? Yeah. Or tell more?
Yeah. So I have a kind of a decision-making flow chart that I use. I didn't create it. I stole it from a friend of mine who I'm 100% positive stole it from somebody else. And like, the line of theft on this thing has to be, a mile long. But it's a really simple decision-making rubric, right? And so the first question that I ask is one of these options, if I'm trying to decide between two things, is one of these options clearly better in the long term? And if the answer is yes, then you just pick that one. Just pick that one. Like, don't be in the business of rooting for the sun not to come up, right? Like, that's a terrible way to live. If one is better in the long term, choose that. That takes out a bunch of decisions, right? Then the next one is one of them better in the short term? Now we've established that this group does not have a better long-term choice. They're even, right? Next question, is one of them better in the short term? If it is, just choose that. Okay. Clearly better long-term, clearly better short-term. Probably 2/3 of our decisions are now off the table, right? Just by thinking about that one little thread, right? Second, or the third question is, can I make this decision over again? Right? Is it a one-way door? So you mentioned, your background as a surgeon, right? There are not a lot of decisions that I imagine you get to make where it's, I can just undo that. There's an undo button. For me, when we were in combat, there's an element of, we can make that decision over again. Not in this exact moment, right? But like we're gonna lay another 100 of these barriers. If this barrier going in place doesn't go perfectly, guys, we can hot wash it real quick and just do it again on the next one, right? Tweak it a little bit. So you give yourself some freedom to experiment, right? And if you can make the decision over, if it's a two-way door, then just pick one option. Just pick one option, because if it doesn't work, you just come back and make the opposite decision. Like, you make the other decision, right? So we're just winnowing down this list of like how many decisions we actually have to think about. Not clear long-term, or clear long-term or not, clear short-term or not, right? Two-way door. Next question is, will the decision get better with more information? And I think that's an interesting question that people don't dig into enough. If you and I today are debating investing in one stock versus another stock, right? Let's just pick two stocks, and we're going to say we're going to choose between one of these two, and we're going to put our entire net worth in one of these two stocks. All right. First of all, terrible decision, but let's just live in a world where we're going to do that. Can that decision get better if we go gather more information, or is to some extent, is it just a matter of chance? In the case of stocks, yeah, we can probably gather some information, right? We can learn more about that company. We can learn more about their industries. Okay, let's say we go to a casino and we decide to bet red versus black on a roulette wheel. Can gathering more information make that decision better? Absolutely not. Totally random chance, right? So if it can't get better with more information, don't spend your time thinking about it. Make a decision and just execute against it.
Interesting.
Right? So then the last question is, if it can get better with more information, now the question is the value of going and getting that information greater than the value of executing right now and having to delay the decision, right? Versus having to delay the decision. Again, to use our stock analogy, right? What if the thing that was required for us to get more information was for us both to drop everything in our lives, right? We're both going to go get MBAs tomorrow. Okay, that's going to take a couple of years. Then we're going to go work for these companies for 3 years, right? And then we'll know, right? Now 5 years later, we'll know. Well, we gave away 5 years worth of earnings, maybe not the greatest option, right? Now that's a hyperbolic example, but there are a lot of situations where if we spend a ton of time trying to gather the information, it doesn't make the decision markedly better. And in that situation, just pick one, right? Now, if you get all the way through that entire rubric and get to the place where there isn't a clear long-term preference, there isn't a clear short-term preference, it's a one-way decision, you do need more information, the information can be gathered in an efficient way, that's the decision you should spend your time on. If you think about your day, how many of those really exist?
I mean, very little. I mean,
there aren't that many. And so what the goal of this whole idea is, and like a lot of this is, that process is something that has come to me in recent years, but I think intuitively I've always thought that way, which is to say, I'm not going to spend my time on the silly stuff. I'm going to steal that time and put it against the intelligent stuff, right? The really tough questions.
Yeah.
And if you think about the way the military operates, it's really rooted in that. So sorry, I stepped on you there.
Yeah. That's really interesting because, it's basically your decision framework is eliminating procrastination, eliminating majority of things. I think we spend over 90% of things worrying about things that aren't going to happen, or in the past, things we have no control over. And so what you're doing is, narrowing the field down, focusing your attention on the most important. Fascinating.
And to be clear, like I don't think that thinking about what could happen is a bad thing, right? Like one of the things the military does really effectively is this idea of like most likely course of action, most dangerous course of action. So as you're thinking about something, what's the most likely thing to occur and what's the greatest challenge to you, right? And so you do some navel gazing, right? But some thinking about like these two this is probably going to happen. And if everything goes wrong, this is going to happen. And if you think about that, by figuring out the most dangerous course of action, right? The worst possible thing. Okay, if I'm prepped for that, then the 100 things that are less dangerous than that, I don't have to worry about. Because if I'm prepped for the worst, then all these little things, who cares? Yeah. They're not as bad as that, and I'm prepared for that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that like it becomes like forcing it to that binary way really is effective at creating more time.
I love that. And the way you describe it is also how a lot of the best athletes, the best teams, how they prepare, their preparation is, relentless, and how they're thinking about things is what you described. What are some of the great, leaders that of course you have that leadership, and who are some of the leaders you emulate? What are their biographies or podcasts, that people can tune into, and also talk a little bit about failure as well.
So in terms of the people that I try to emulate, it's interesting. I think that when it comes to lead, like I've been really blessed to have worked for some great people. I've been really blessed to have worked for some not great people. I think there's a blessing in both, right? It's one thing to say, I'm going to learn from success and emulate success, but I think you can actually learn just as much, if not more, from somebody who fails or somebody who falls short. Because while success might be very narrowly defined circumstantially, I think failure can be very universal. If somebody is really good at picking a particular industry, or at picking, in this situation, they manage the world perfectly. Okay, that's great. But Heraclitus said, like, you're not going to step in the same river twice, right? You're not going to be in that situation. And so I think there's an element of that being wrong is a bit more universal than being right. And so I really feel like I'm blessed to have gotten to see both. The other thing that I really try hard to do is wherever I am, whatever I'm doing, whatever I'm focusing on, I want to take lessons from things outside of that. So when I was in the military, I didn't read a lot of military leadership books. I didn't read a lot about how guys had led under fire in previous conflicts. And in large part, it was because, one, that stuff is built into doctrine, right? We've learned that and we've put it into doctrine. So I'm getting it already. But two, I think there's risk in not diversifying your thought process, right? There's a risk in not looking at those other areas. And it is that you can become very insular in your thinking. So, in terms of like the people that I really emulate and try to, I don't want to say idolize, but like the role models, right? I think, the book Hard Thing About Hard Things, Brad Horowitz's book, I think is the single best business book ever written. I try to read it once a month. I encourage like every single person I work with should buy it, tattoo it on their arm, right? Like you got to be comfortable with some profanity because it's not the most kindergarten friendly book, but it's fabulous. I think Andy Grove's Only the Paranoid Survive, right? So from some Silicon Valley folks. But I also really think the book Steal My Soldier's Hearts by David Hackworth is an incredible book about how to turn around a culture, and I think it's incredibly applicable in business. So I find that things like that are really interesting. I love reading about great coaches, seeing whether it's John Wooden, whether it's Phil, even guys on the other side of the spectrum, right? Reading some of the things about what Vince Lombardi did and like kind of those more tyrannical coaches. Like I think there's an interesting thing you can take away from all of those. But I think the biggest thing is whenever I read or listen or watch or anything, like whenever I consume any kind of content, the first thing I do is try to consume something on the other side. I really want to balance it. And I think a lot of it is it's that desire to say, like, let's have some diversity of thought. Let's have some diversity of perspective. I think investing in one industry is great as long as that industry is up, right? But I think there's a whole lot of folks who invested in office space who, when that pandemic hit, maybe they weren't particularly enthusiastic about their returns, right? And I think there's advantage in intellectually doing the same thing.
How can people reach out to you, check out your website, social media, check out your work, contact you?
ClintRusch.com is the best way to get in touch with me. There's a contact me on there. I've collected my kind of guiding principles and the way that I think about life and about business, and it's all on there. And so I'm continually updating that and tweaking that as I learn more and kind of go on that self-discovery journey.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for coming onto the show and talking about decisions, framework, and all of your resources will be in the links and show notes for the listeners. And thanks so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.